So I've been asked to make a few closing comments as a way of sort of thinking about the day as a whole. And I'd like to do so by beginning with some thanks and acknowledgement. First, to Elizabeth Kennedy Gish, who does the scheduling and the organization of all of this, and I know she has people working with her. It's been a really wonderful and fantastic symposium, and I think we need to acknowledge her. Thank you so much. She's here somewhere. And then I think probably one of the most important things that we need to do here now in this particular time and space is to acknowledge and thank the staff members at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian who actually do the very hard work of repatriation. You know, we've heard from a number of speakers about the costs and the difficulties of this. These things carry spiritual costs, they carry emotional costs, and the work here is not easy, and I've certainly been able to, with my colleagues, see exactly how difficult it can sometimes be, and also see the ways that our staff, the people here at this museum, always rise to the occasion and produce amazing kinds of work. Their commitment is unparalleled. So I'd like to actually list them by name. Jackie Swift, Terry Snowball, Lauren Sieg, Carrie Feldman, Risa Arbolino, Nancy Kennett Vickery, and Stephanie Maxine Kelly. Thank you for all the good work that you do. You know, my first encounter with repatriation in a kind of serious institutional way echoed some of the things we've heard today. I was on the advisory board for the Denver Art Museum and the Colorado Historical Society back in the early 90s. We did some of the very first consultations with those organizations, and there was exactly the fear that the semi-truck was going to pull up. The consultation I remember most was with Cheyenne River. 4 or 5 folks came down from Cheyenne River. The museum pulled out about 250 objects and set them out on tables. There was a great deal of anxiety and trepidation about this. There was the assumption that people were going to come and take everything. And it was an amazing afternoon, actually, because what happened, of course, and this is a story that will be familiar to many of you, folks from Cheyenne River came in, they walked through every object, and they gave so much value to the university in terms of naming, defining, storying the objects. And at the end of the afternoon, they had identified perhaps 4 things that they thought they wanted to continue conversations with our organization, with the Art Museum, about repatriation. So the value trade-off here, I think, left every person in the administration of that museum astonished. And of course, now we've seen 20-some years, right, of these kinds of relationships. And as we've talked a lot about today, the building of partnerships, you know, with tribes and with museums. You know, I moved to Michigan in 2001, to the University of Michigan, and one of the things that greeted me there, although it didn't become apparent for a few years, was what had been a fairly flawed NAGPRA process in the early years of NAGPRA. I think not because of any ill intent, but because I think actually operationalizing the law was not that easy for the first generation of people who were doing it. After a significant amount of pushing on the part of Native graduate students and cranky faculty members, the University of Michigan actually, I would say, turned a pretty big corner in terms of its own museum process. And it was pretty interesting for me to be in the middle of watching how that happens, how an institution actually can make changes to its policies, to its processes, and I think more importantly to its values, to the values that it represents. So Cecil and I were talking today, and I think it's just simply worth noting that today, actually, not just like today, but like today, on this day, the University of Michigan Museum is actually repatriating 94 ancestral human remains and 812 associated funerary objects right now to Michigan tribes, kind of as we speak, actually. Yeah, I think that's... So if we think a little bit about the panels that we've seen today, we've had really four different panels, and they bring to us 4 bits of information that are worth, I think, just pausing and meditating on for a moment. The first panel really asks us to think, well, how and why did we get here? How did we get to the place where we are today? We talked about these sort of century-old, as we've talked about all day, these century-old historical kinds of practices, right, which established a context for everything that has followed afterwards, right? The medical collection, the anthropological, ethnographic kind of collection of Native American human remains and funerary objects. But we also talked, I think, in really interesting and very productive ways about the 25 years of effort that led up to the acts that created NAGPRA and the NMAIA. And then about that very interesting kind of 2-year legislative kind of push. And what comes out of this, I think, is a recognition about just how complicated this world is and how hard it is to drive change, but how it happens from different kinds of directions, in multiple ways, constellations of things coming together at certain moments. So certainly the Indian-driven action, the Indian agency, right? Native people actually taking charge. Suzanne Schoenharjo's wonderful account of 1967 and being at Bear Butte for 4 days after ceremony and having a conversation and having Vietnam vets say the repatriation of specific individuals from Vietnam offers us a kind of a model, right? A military kind of model about formality and process that maybe we should think more about. This was a stunning kind of story. Then we heard about the Museum of the American Indian in New York and the kind of horrific conditions with swamp rats and things like that running around. We heard about Senator Daniel Inouye's commitment to this and his ability to move Congress along. We heard even about a sort of revisionist history of Ross Perot, who I like much better now than I did before. We thought a little bit about the social context in which this happened, this played out, the multicultural moments of the 1980s, which I think actually made a difference, and about the coalitions and political cultural struggles, right, that attend all of these kinds of things. So those things that led us up to that moment in 1989, 1990, these things are really interesting and important, and they need to always be part of our historical memory about the things that we do, right? They brought us here. Our second panel asks us to think, well, what and how have we done things, or what have we done with it, the things that we have? So we talked about and we thought about and we heard about new kinds of curation, about the various differences across institutions and how those things get navigated. And we heard a lot about things that I think are actually really, really important, about process, about procedure, about definition, about the mechanics of it all. These things which are developed on the ground by people who are working hard. Many of you in this audience, right, are exactly the folks we're talking about. People working hard on the ground all the time, right, to develop the ways that we actually do what it is that we do. In our third panel, we thought and we heard a bit about what it's meant for tribes and for Native people in general. And some of these things that we heard are, I think, they are generalizable. Others are very specific, and they give us a sense of the range of experience that happens out there on the ground. So we heard about things like toxic repatriation, right? Quite a stunning account of what it means to achieve a kind of victory in terms of repatriating objects only to find that they are contaminated to the point of being absolutely physically dangerous. We heard about repatriating not only remains and objects, but as Bobby Connor spoke about, repatriating knowledge, right, into communities. We heard about the kinds of risks that I mentioned earlier, personal, spiritual, emotional sorts of risks. We heard about capacity building and building of staff in response to what is, in fact, new labor, right? As we all know, new labor put onto tribes in relation to this. But this capacity building, I think, has proven to be a very, very important thing in Indian country. And then we heard about interesting partnerships with, for example, the BLM, and this sort of sense that we may have a very interesting and productive future of reburial on public lands if and when we can figure out the procedures and the processes and the mechanics of how to actually make that work. And then in our fourth session, we've heard a bit about the consequences and maybe even a little bit about the roots of repatriation in a global context. And this, is, of course, is a conversation that is kind of omnipresent, in Indian country and certainly in my realm and scholarship these days, which is to say we've spent a lot of time thinking about the relationship between the tribal and the national, and now we find ourselves almost always having to pair that with a set of thoughts about the tribal and the international and how that works and how the nation actually makes its way in or doesn't make its way in, as the case may be. So in some very real senses, I think the accounts that we've just heard in this fourth session really do take us into quite logically, the large realms in which we'll be thinking about, over the future. So when I try to sort of take our four panels and this kind of, I think, historical narrative and try to build a couple of categories that we might use in thinking about repatriation and thinking about this legacy of 25 years, I end up with four categories, and I just simply want to just touch on them very, very quickly and briefly, and some of them will be things that I've just said. So the first, I think, does have to do with procedure and bureaucracy. And for me, it seems to take two different sort of paths to think about this. One is the path about the state, right? That the state is actually an actor that really matters a lot here in terms of oversight, in terms of surveillance. Kevin mentioned the fact that the General Accounting Office did come and did a review. We were all a little nervous about it. I'd never been interviewed by the GAO before. It was kind of an experience. There was 6 of them or something like that. They brought the trustees into a room and they asked us a whole bunch of really hard questions. They were not friendly. You could not make a joke with them. They did not smile. This felt like the power of the state, right? Sort of sitting heavy. But the fact is that review actually helped push a number of repatriation projects, and it is the moment where the state was actually useful and important. So that's part of it. Another part of it is this question about process, which is to say getting a complicated thing right? Being good and clean about record keeping, about the physical qualities of objects, right? About things like pesticides and arsenics and things like that. Both of these, I think, have been very, very productive. It's easy to sort of write off process, procedure, and bureaucracy as not being a productive thing, but I think that's exactly wrong in this case. I think these things have been very, very productive. They have built capacities. They have set up patterns and categories of knowledge that have been useful to tribal people. So this has been an interesting and good thing. But of course, whenever we talk about institutional power and these sorts of things, we also have to talk about the flip side, as many of our panelists did. Bonnie mentioned this, Suzanne mentioned this, Don mentioned this, about the ways that institutional power actually also can press heavy on some of the things that we do. So the sense that we need to turn off the science, that we need to sort of think a little bit about notes that I can't read on my paper here, about who makes the decisions, right? Who actually ends up, at the end of the day, making decisions? And should we imagine to continually rebalance that with the tribal and the institutional? So this sense about bureaucracy and procedure, I think, is an important thing, and is a theme that comes out of our day today. A second theme that comes out, then, is a kind of question about morals, ethics, and human rights. And when I say morals and ethics, I think one of the things that's implied here is that these are not necessarily universals. Whereas when we talk about human rights, there is often a tendency to sort of think about these things as having universal terms, right? So when the UN makes a declaration on the rights of indigenous people, it's drawing on a human rights kind of argument, and it's making a claim to something that has universal, perhaps universal sort of power. Those two things, I think, exist in a certain kind of tension here. The bottom line is in this process of repatriation that we never lose sight of the larger picture, right, as what is ethically and morally right as we can understand it, right? So on one level, it's a fairly simple answer, which we oftentimes hear and speak when we engage in this. It's simply a question of human dignity. But on another level, right, moral and ethical interests of different groups are not always aligned with one another. And so what we do on this front actually turns out to be much more complicated, much more interesting, and much more challenging than I think it at first appears to be. Now, these two things, it seemed to me, feed into the third category that I want to mention, which is simply the category of the tribal. I'm not sure that this is exactly the right word I want to use here, but thinking about sovereignty and thinking about self-determination kinds of things. I am, a child of a sovereignty family, and I have many friends in the scholarly community who aren't going with me, on that anymore, but I'm still there. So thinking a bit about political and legal sovereignty and what it means for tribes, I think it's really important the ways that repatriation is a moment when tribes step up, exercise their sovereignty, combine capacity building with moral claims to history. right? And that's a really important thing when we think about how we claim self-determination, how we claim sovereignty. And then the last of the four categories really is the category that Cecil Pavlat took us to, I think, so nicely here to close out the last session, which is the category of the spiritual, right? The spiritual. So everything that we do here, right? All the meetings, all the procedures, all the strategies, all the moral and ethical conversations, all those things are underpinned and based on our engagement, right, with the spiritual world, right, which has everything to do with the power that is there, which is real, sometimes dangerous, and the obligation then that we have, right, to taking that seriously. And with the obligation then comes our commitment to do things. And that's the place where we come to rest, I think, when we talk about repatriation and we talk about the last 25 years. All these things wrap up together in one package, which I think different forms and different proportions perhaps makes up the motivations that most of us bring to the table and to this room today. So with that, I want to turn to Clayton Old Elk, who will offer us a closing blessing.
How about a nice round of applause for Mr. Philip Deloria for the wonderful job he's done. I want to thank the museum for inviting me and for coming today. I'm going to give the blessing, the closing blessing, and in that, when my grandfather gave me my identity, a Crow name, Bilage Muja, Fights on Water, along with that came a song, a praise song. So at the end of my prayer, I'm going to sing my praise song in honor of all of you, and to you too as well. So if you bow your heads and pray with me. My heart is good, and I'm singing. Congratulations. Aho. Have a safe journey. Thank you.
I want to thank Clayton Old Elk for the blessing, and I want to thank all of you for attending. And of course, as all events at the NMAIA do, we conclude with a wonderful reception out in the Potomac atrium. So I hope you all join and continue the conversation out there. Thank you all so much.